All right, so picking up where we left off last week, this is Monday, the summary for Monday, September 28th. And we're going to try to sort of finish up the cosmological argument for God's existence today, although it may trail over into tomorrow a little bit. But just to remind you what we did last time we were talking about the cosmological argument, we were defending premise B. The reason we defended premise B first is that that's the one that was traditionally attacked. That's the historical conversation, really. Everyone asked themselves, okay, did the universe really have a beginning? We defended that philosophically and then with observational science. What we want to do today is talk about another conversation that is had quite often regarding the cosmological argument, and that has to do with the idea of everything that begins to exist has a cause, or can something pop into existence out of nothing? In this case, there is some conversation among cosmologists and physicists that try to imply that the relationship between cause and effect breaks down if you get to the very early universe, or maybe even to before the universe began, that cause and effect is not applicable prior to the universe's existence. So they might assert then that the universe can cause itself, that the universe can be its own cause, because cause and effect may in fact be sort of overlapping prior to the universe's beginning. And so what we see is a thesis given by Stephen Hawking in this case, but actually we could look elsewhere. There's a man named Lawrence Krauss, an American physicist, who makes a very similar argument in a book that he wrote that he called A Universe Out of Nothing. This book is a little bit more impactful in the conversation. So in this case, it's called The Grand Design by Stephen Hawking, and he basically says, because a law like gravity exists, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. That's the main thesis of the book. Now, what we did in class is actually watch a clip of a lecture given by a man named John Lennox. Dr. John Lennox is a double PhD at Oxford University. He's a Christian. Pure mathematics is one of his PhDs, and then the other PhD is in the philosophy of science. And he does a really good job of breaking down some of the problems with Stephen Hawking's work, especially with the philosophy of it. So what I'm going to give you is a summary of what he says, and then I'm actually going to post a link to his lecture as well in case you're interested in watching it. And also, I would highly suggest it. It's about an hour and 10 minutes long, and I think it's quite good. It gives you a real sense of how maybe faith and science could interact and how they could relate to one another. Anyway, here's how he basically breaks down his critique of Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, and this possibility, this thesis that says, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. John Lennox says, wait a second. First, he says, this thesis is guilty of scientism. Now, we mentioned scientism before in our course, but it basically means the overemphasis on science or over-reliance on science, this belief that says science can answer every question, or moreover, that only science can answer our questions in a trustworthy manner, that scientists are the bearers of truth. And scientism is a really poor starting place. I would say maybe the biggest reason why scientism is a poor place to start in this conversation is those who are guilty of scientism do not recognize when they're no longer saying something scientific and they have bled into philosophy, for instance, or theology. Not every statement made by a scientist is a scientific statement. But those who are guilty of scientism don't often understand when the lines have become blurred and when they have transitioned away from science and into a more metaphysical conversation. And in that regard, we end up starting to see simple mistakes being made in philosophy or in theology that wouldn't be made if it was recognized that that's what we were talking about, philosophy or theology. So scientism is not a good place to start, but it is where Hawking starts. And John Lennox does a great job looking through that if you take a look at the lecture. Breaking down the thesis itself, we see a major problem right away. Hawking in his book, as does Lawrence Krauss actually in his book, they try to redefine the word nothing. They say, in the case of the Grand Design, because there is a law like gravity, the universe will create itself out of nothing. They're basically saying because something exists, the universe created itself out of nothing. That is obviously illogical. What they seem to be implying, or they try to communicate apparently, is that a quantum vacuum is co-equal with nothing, or that the word nothing should be understood to mean a quantum vacuum. But that's not nothing. A quantum vacuum is something that includes the laws of physics. It includes energy, and there is some inclination that perhaps even within a quantum vacuum, there is material in the universe. Um, Somebody might say, look, we can observe in a quantum vacuum fluctuations that seem to mean something comes out of nothing, but they're still misdefining the word nothing. A quantum vacuum is not nothing. It includes laws and includes energy. These things are not nothing. A second major issue is that he basically says the universe can create itself. Um, he uses the universe's existence to account for the existence of the universe. It may be simpler if we talk about it in terms of x and y, like you might do in algebra. Remember, for instance, if we said something like x creates y, we are presupposing the existence of x to bring about the existence of y. But if we say the universe creates itself, we're essentially saying x creates x. But that doesn't make sense. That's not logical. X cannot create x. That would presuppose the existence of x to account for the existence of x. It would mean X already had to be in existence to bring about the effect, which was, again, itself. That's illogical. That's very, very poor philosophy. But Hawking actually has gone out of his way in his scientism to try to say that philosophy is dead. Perhaps it's so he could get away with things like this, which is rather sloppy logic. The last mistake that he makes that I really want to focus in on is this. It's an agency error. You might call it a category error. That's what John Lennox calls it, as a category error. And he basically misunderstands the relationship between the laws of physics and God. He uses what's known as a God of the gaps argument to sort of set up a forced choice between the laws of physics and God, and you must choose one or the other to understand how the universe functions or what brought the universe into existence. But this is a misunderstanding of how explanation works. There is a difference between explaining how something works and explaining why something works. So I want to kind of demonstrate that with this slide, that this God of the gaps way of thinking is incorrect. So here's what I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine that this line that's appearing on the screen right now is representative of all that there is to know, everything that one could know about the universe. And of course, when human beings, history started, we didn't know that much. You might say that this line represents everything that we use to know. What we know was a pretty small fraction of what there is to know. And so you can notice, of course, that there's a massive gap between what we know and what we could know, or what there is to know. And so historically, the way Stephen Hawking represents it at least, and I would say Christians are guilty of this from time to time, historically we've said, aha, that's where God comes in. He did the thing that we don't understand or don't know how it works. So we have this line here, we say, God must have done it. We don't know where life came from, God must have done it. That gap in our understanding. We don't know how cells self-assemble, aha, God must do it. And so we have this gap that we place God in, and we say, that's why I have faith. We have this need for an explanation, and God is my explanation. But notice, if I actually expand my knowledge, if I come to understand more about the world and the universe around me, there's a much smaller gap then for God to fit into. So if this is what I have come to know, or what we as a human race have come to know, the gap for God is much smaller. And we say, well, this is what's left over for God to do. And with that gap shrinking, we start to say, oh, there's a competition here. I have a scientific understanding of how this works, and then I've got what's left over for God to do. And as we see this gap shrinking, we start to think, that's the friction. That's the tension between science and faith. Faith is just what's left over that we don't understand. That is a completely erroneous way of thinking about faith. That's not how it works. For instance, this is how Stephen Hawking would talk. He would say, okay, what if we could come up with a theory of everything? What if we could understand everything that there is to know about our universe? And we came up with a line that is, all the way across. Then we wouldn't need God. But this is itself a really problematic view of God. God is not a God of the gaps. He's a God of everything. In fact, he uses the things that we do understand in his governing of the universe. We might say it this way. We would say how something works and why something works are not at odds with one another. They're complementary concepts. They come together to give a full explanation. God uses law and nature to govern the universe. Let me give you two parables that I hope will sort of explain what I mean to say that these are complementary explanations for the way the universe functions. The first one, just imagine you walk into a room and there's a tea kettle boiling or whistling. And you say, what's the explanation for this? Why is this tea kettle whistling? And someone gives you a scientific explanation. They say, well, the heat energy from the stovetop is being conducted by the metal tea kettle and then transferred into the water molecules, which are speeding up rapidly as they heat up, and they're transferring from liquid to gas. And of course, gas will fill up any space that it's kept in, according to Boyle's law. And so the pressure will build up and it will shoot out this little hole at the tea kettle and will whistle. That's a scientific explanation for why the tea kettle is whistling. Of course, somebody else might say, well, I want a tea, so I put it on the stovetop. Those are not actually competing explanations. They both are true. They're both true. The laws of nature are giving us how the tea kettle came to be whistling, but the person putting the tea kettle on the stovetop is why it came to be whistling. We don't have to choose between the two. We can see them as complementary. It's the same thing if we consider this. Imagine you stumbled across some piece of machinery in the jungle, we'll say. And imagine this is 120 years ago, and so you don't know what this machinery is. Let's say it's actually a car, but you don't know what a car is because it's 120 years ago. But imagine you came to study it, and you pulled it apart, and you checked out the engine. You came to really understand, how does a car work? You might say, oh, I get it. Like, you turn this key and it turns on and there's combustion in the carburetor, and we send the energy to the pistons and they start churning and the axle turns and off we go. You could explain how the car works. But that doesn't mean you don't need Henry Ford anymore. Henry Ford is the explanation for why that car works that way. He designed it. So for us to be able to say, I understand how the universe works, doesn't replace God. Because God actually then is the reason why the universe works that way. He put the tea kettle on the stove, or he designed the engine, to use our little parables. That's, I think, a better way of understanding the relationship between science and faith. In fact, it becomes even more beautiful, because if I see God as the designer of the things that I do understand about the universe, then I come to say, whoa, the intricacies, the depth, the beauty of the design actually gives me more appreciation for God. So now my faith has increased. I find the Creator more beautiful, more impressive, more worthy of my adoration now that I've studied what it is He created. In fact, I think that this is sort of circular in its contribution, because we have already talked about this idea of fides quorens intellectum, Latin for faith-seeking understanding. So I might say, I want to understand how the world works because I have faith in God, the Creator, and I want to know more about Him. And as I come to know more about how the world works, I actually increase in my faith and my adoration for God. The relationship between science and faith in this way is complementary, not in the end actually antagonistic at all. These two things are supporting and complementing one another. In the end, what is actually happening with Stephen Hawking is he's proposing that there is a reason why this universe came into existence. And even though his thesis is this, because a law like gravity exists, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing, what he's really saying is that the universe came into existence within a multiverse. This is something we're going to have to talk about at length, because it actually applies to our next argument for God's existence, the teleological argument. But in a sense, all that Hawking really has done, if he is to say that the universe came into existence within the multiverse, is actually just move our argument one step further down the road. Because we could just replace the word universe in the cosmological argument with multiverse and it would still work. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The multiverse began to exist, therefore the multiverse must have a cause. And that's true because the Borde, Guth, and Vilenkin theorem still applies. There must be a